Continue to monitor today's major case at the Supreme Court. Justices are hearing arguments on the president's authority to impose tariffs on any international country. CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman is live outside of the Supreme Court and joins me now to talk about it. Katrina, all right, here's where we're looking. Catch us up. What have we learned so far?
Hi, Vlad. Well, first of all, I'm out in front of the Supreme Court, and there is a long line of people here who are waiting to get into these arguments. This is such a big case that it's really drawing a crowd. But so far, there has been a lot of pushback. John Sauer is arguing on behalf of the Trump administration right now, and he's arguing to a court of originalists, of textualists, of people who rely on statutory interpretation. And Vlad, they keep asking him about the way he's trying to use the language here to regulate importation. Justice Amy Coney Barrett was pushing back a lot on him. She said, can you point to any place in the statutory code?
Okay. So imagine this, you're watching the news, scrolling through your feed, and suddenly you see it. Supreme Court delivers historic ruling, Trump's power crumbles, presidential immunity stripped away, and you're thinking, wait, what just happened? Is this real? Because for years, we've been hearing about executive privilege, about presidential immunity, about how certain people are basically untouchable because of the office they hold. And now, in one massive ruling, the Supreme Court just said, nope, not anymore. That protection you thought you had, it's gone. And the fallout is immediate, it's dramatic, and it's absolutely changing everything. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
A really key case about the balance of power. John Sauer has been arguing that the president has broad authority when it comes to foreign affairs, that he has the inherent power to regulate foreign commerce. He also said that these are regulatory tariffs. He said they're not revenue-raising tariffs. He said that creates a distinction here, Vlad. So there's been a lot of pushback. They're also talking about the major questions doctrine quite a bit, which says you can't make rules on issues of vast economic or political significance unless Congress has specifically conferred that power. And then Sauer has also been hearkening back to a case related to Nixon. It was an earlier version of the law that IEPA now is, and Nixon had used that to invoke his ability to tax. And so the Trump administration is relying on that quite a bit, but the justices are really pushing back here.
This isn't some procedural technicality buried in legal jargon that only lawyers care about. This is the Supreme Court of the United States declaring that a president, even a former president, is not above the law, that presidential immunity only covers core official acts, the actual constitutional duties of the office. Everything else, fair game for prosecution, fair game for lawsuits, fair game for accountability, and for Trump, who's been fighting off investigations, criminal charges, civil cases, and congressional inquiries for years by hiding behind claims of absolute immunity, this is a complete collapse of his legal defense strategy. The shield he's been using to deflect everything just shattered into a million pieces. Let's talk about what happened. July 1st, 2024, the Supreme Court issues its ruling in Trump versus United States, and the language is crystal clear. A president is not immune for unofficial acts, nor for any actions outside his constitutional duties. He is answerable to the law, period. No wiggle room, no gray area, no broad interpretation that lets presidents do whatever they want and claim immunity later. The court drew a hard line and said, this far and no further. Your official duties as president are protected. Everything else, you're a citizen like everyone else, and you face the same legal consequences as everyone else. Now think about what this means for Trump specifically. All those cases that have been stalled, delayed, tied up in appeals because Trump's lawyers kept arguing he has absolute immunity, they're back on. Within hours of the ruling, lower courts started restarting criminal and civil cases. Grand juries resumed their work. Prosecutors who had been forced to wait are now moving forward. Fraud trials, obstruction hearings, investigations into the fake elector schemes, attempts to block congressional certification on January 6th, all of it is suddenly active again. The legal machinery that had been frozen in place just roared back to life. And it's not just criminal cases, asset freezes that have been on hold, they're in effect now. Fraud judgments and financial penalties that Trump's been fighting, they're being enforced. The financial pressure, the legal pressure, the political pressure, it's all mounting at once. And there's no immunity shield to hide behind anymore. Legal experts are calling this a collapse of executive protection, a historic moment where the Supreme Court reinforced that no president is above the law, not during their term, and definitely not after they leave office. Can you believe this? After years of watching Trump dodge consequences, after years of hearing about executive privilege and presidential immunity and all these legal protections that seem to make him untouchable, the Supreme Court just said actually none of that applies to what he's being investigated for. Because running fake elector schemes, that's not an official act. Trying to overturn an election, that's not a constitutional duty. Pressuring officials to find votes or block certification, not protected. All of it falls outside the narrow scope of what presidential immunity actually covers. And that changes everything. Here's why this matters so much. For decades, there's been this assumption, this understanding that presidents have broad immunity, that the office itself provides protection, not just during the term, but potentially forever for actions taken while in office. And that assumption has shaped how presidents behave, how they're investigated, how they're held accountable or not held accountable. But the Supreme Court just rewritten the rules. They said no, immunity is narrow, it's specific, it's limited to core constitutional functions. And if you step outside that, you're fair game. You're answerable to criminal law, to civil law, to the same justice system as everyone else. And the reaction has been immediate. Congress is accelerating investigations, citing the Supreme Court's explicit guidance that no president is above the law. Federal prosecutors are moving forward with cases they had to pause. State prosecutors are doing the same. Civil plaintiffs are pursuing their cases. It's like a dam broke, and suddenly all this legal action that had been held back is flooding forward at once. And Trump? He's at the center of all of it, with no immunity defense left to use. Think about the timing here too. This ruling came down in the summer of 2024, but we're seeing the effects cascade through 2025 and beyond. Courts are applying this precedent. New cases are being filed. Old cases are being revived. The Supreme Court didn't just rule on one specific case. They set a precedent that applies to everything. Every investigation, every lawsuit, every criminal charge that involves actions outside core presidential duties. And that's a lot of cases. That's a lot of legal exposure. That's a lot of trouble for someone who built their entire legal strategy around claiming absolute immunity. This is the story. Not just another court ruling, not just another legal setback. This is a fundamental shift in how presidential power and accountability work in this country. This is the Supreme Court drawing a clear line and saying the presidency doesn't give you a free pass to break the law. And we're going to break down exactly what the court said, what cases are moving forward now, what this means for Trump's political future, and why this moment represents a historic turning point for executive accountability. Because this isn't just about one person. This is about whether our system of checks and balances actually works, whether presidents can be held accountable, whether the rule of law applies to everyone or just to some people. Let's get into it. All right, so let's dig into what actually happened here. Because to understand why this Supreme Court ruling is so massive, you need to understand what Trump has been arguing for years and why the court just completely rejected it. Trump's legal team has been pushing this theory of absolute presidential immunity, the idea that anything a president does while in office is protected by immunity, that you can't prosecute a president, you can't sue a president, and you can't even investigate certain actions because the office itself provides blanket protection. And they've used this argument to delay, obstruct, and fight off pretty much every legal challenge Trump has faced. It's been the cornerstone of his legal defense strategy, the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. But here's the thing. That's not what presidential immunity actually means under the law. And the Supreme Court just made that crystal clear. Presidential immunity, the court said, only protects core official acts, the actual constitutional duties of the president. Things like commanding the military, conducting foreign policy, signing or vetoing legislation, the specific powers granted by the Constitution, those are protected. But everything else, actions that fall outside those constitutional duties, those are not protected by immunity. And that distinction is huge. Because most of what Trump is being investigated for, most of what he's facing charges for, falls outside that narrow scope of official acts. Let's talk specifics. The fake elector scheme. Trump and his allies organized slates of fake electors in multiple states, people who falsely claim to be the legitimate electors, even though Trump lost those states. Is that an official act? Is that a constitutional duty of the president? No. That's election fraud. That's conspiracy. That's a crime. And the Supreme Court's ruling makes clear that immunity doesn't apply. Trying to pressure state officials to find votes or overturn election results, not an official act. Attempting to block congressional certification of the election on January 6th, not an official act. Organizing rallies and directing crowds toward the Capitol, definitely not an official act. The Supreme Court looked at all of this and said, look, we're not going to let you hide behind the presidency for actions that have nothing to do with your constitutional duties. If you committed crimes, if you engaged in fraud, if you conspired to overturn an election, You don't get immunity just because you were president at the time. You're answerable to the law like everyone else. And that's exactly what the ruling stated. A president is not immune for unofficial acts, nor for any actions outside his constitutional duties. He is answerable to the law. Those words matter. They're direct. They're unambiguous. There's no room for interpretation or creative lawyering. Now, what happened immediately after this ruling came down? Chaos for Trump's legal team and action for prosecutors. Within hours, and I mean literally hours, lower courts started restarting cases that had been stalled. Criminal grand juries that had been paused resumed their work. Civil cases that had been frozen moved forward. Judges who had been waiting for clarity from the Supreme Court suddenly had it, and they acted. The fraud trial in New York, back on. The obstruction case related to January 6th, moving forward. Civil lawsuits from police officers injured during the Capitol riot, proceeding. Asset freezes and financial penalties that had been delayed, taking effect immediately. It's like everything hit at once. And Trump's legal team, which had been successfully using immunity claims to delay and obstruct for years, suddenly had nothing. Their main defense strategy just evaporated. And when that happens, when you lose your primary legal shield, everything else becomes much harder to fight. You can't just say, I have immunity, case dismissed. Now you actually have to defend against the charges. You have to argue the facts. You have to face the evidence. And in Trump's case, the evidence is extensive and damaging. Let's talk about the financial impact too, because this isn't just about criminal charges. Trump has been fighting civil fraud cases where courts have found him liable for hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties. But enforcement of those judgments had been delayed, tied up in appeals, partially frozen because of immunity claims. Well, those claims are gone now. The money is due. The assets can be seized. The penalties are being enforced. And we're talking about massive sums here. Fraud judgments that could bankrupt his organization. Asset freezes that lock up properties and accounts. Financial pressure that makes it impossible to operate business as usual. And here's where it gets really interesting. Congress also jumped on this ruling immediately because congressional investigations had been hamstrung by executive privilege claims and immunity arguments. Trump would refuse to testify, refuse to hand over documents, refuse to cooperate, and his lawyers would argue that immunity protects him. But the Supreme Court just said no, it doesn't, not for actions outside your constitutional duties. So Congress accelerated its investigations. New subpoenas went out, new hearings were scheduled, new document demands were issued, and this time, the immunity defense doesn't work. This time, Trump either has to comply or face contempt charges. Legal experts across the spectrum are calling this a watershed moment because for decades, the scope of presidential immunity has been this murky, unsettled area of law. Presidents claim broad immunity. Courts were hesitant to rule against sitting presidents. The whole system kind of operated on this understanding that presidents were in a special category. But the Supreme Court just clarified the law in a way that limits presidential immunity significantly. They said, no, you don't get broad immunity. You get narrow immunity for core official acts. Everything else, you're accountable like everyone else. And the precedent here extends beyond just Trump. This ruling affects every president, current and future. It sets clear boundaries on what immunity covers. It makes clear that presidents can be investigated, charged, and held accountable for crimes committed in office if those crimes fall outside constitutional duties. That's huge. That changes the entire landscape of executive accountability. Media coverage has been intense. This is front page news everywhere. Legal analysts are doing deep dives into what this means. Political commentators are discussing the implications, and the consensus is pretty clear. This is one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in modern history because it fundamentally redefines the relationship between the presidency and the law. For Trump personally, this is a disaster. His entire legal strategy for years has been built on immunity claims, on the idea that he's protected by the office he held, and in one ruling, the Supreme Court demolished that strategy. Now he's facing multiple criminal investigations with no immunity defense, multiple civil cases with no protection from judgments, congressional investigations with no executive privilege shield. The legal walls are closing in from every direction at once, and there's no escape hatch anymore, no legal maneuver that makes it all go away. And it's not just the immediate legal threats. This ruling has political implications too, because Trump's entire political persona has been built on this image of being untouchable, of being able to do whatever he wants and get away with it, of being above the rules that apply to everyone else. But the Supreme Court just said, actually, you're not above the rules. You're subject to the same laws as everyone else. And that punctures the aura of invincibility. It shows that the system can hold him accountable, that there are limits to what he can get away with, and that changes how people view him politically. We're also seeing allies start to distance themselves, because when someone is facing this level of legal jeopardy, when the immunity defense is gone and serious charges are moving forward, political allies start calculating their own risk. Do they want to be associated with someone who might be convicted of crimes? Do they want to defend actions that courts have said are not protected? the political calculus shifts, and we're seeing that play out in real time. Fewer Republicans rushing to Trump's defense, more hedging language, more distance, because the Supreme Court ruling gave everyone permission to step back and say, well, the courts have spoken, the law is clear, there's nothing we can do. So where does this leave us? Trump is facing unprecedented legal pressure with no immunity shield to hide behind. Criminal cases are proceeding, civil judgments are being enforced, financial penalties are mounting, congressional investigations are accelerating, and the Supreme Court has made clear that none of this is protected by presidential immunity. This is the collapse of executive protection that legal experts have been talking about. This is what accountability looks like when it finally catches up to someone who's been evading it for years, and we're watching it happen in real time. Okay, let's break this down into clear points so everyone understands exactly what this means and what comes next. Because this is complex, it's historic, and it has massive implications for Trump, for the presidency, and for how our legal system works. Point 1, presidential immunity is not what Trump claimed it was. For years, Trump and his lawyers have argued for this expansive view of presidential immunity. The idea that pretty much anything a president does is protected, that you can't investigate, charge, or sue a president for actions taken in office. But the Supreme Court just rejected that completely. They said no, immunity is narrow. It only covers core official acts, the specific constitutional duties of the presidency. Everything else is fair game. And that distinction matters because most of what Trump is being investigated for falls outside that narrow scope. Fake elector schemes, not official acts. Pressuring officials to overturn elections, not official acts. Organizing efforts to block congressional certification, not official acts. None of it is protected by immunity, and now Trump has to face the legal consequences without that shield. Point 2, the floodgates have opened. Within hours of this ruling, cases that had been stalled for years started moving again. Criminal grand juries resumed, civil trials proceeded, asset freezes took effect. It's like all the legal pressure that had been building up behind the immunity defense suddenly burst through at once. Prosecutors who had been forced to wait now have the green light. Judges who had been holding cases pending the Supreme Court ruling now have clear guidance, and they're acting on it immediately. We're talking about multiple criminal cases, multiple civil lawsuits, fraud judgments worth hundreds of millions of dollars, congressional investigations, all of it happening simultaneously. The sheer volume of legal action Trump is facing right now is unprecedented, and without the immunity defense, his options for fighting it all are much more limited. Point 3, this sets a historic precedent for all future presidents. This isn't just about Trump. The Supreme Court's ruling establishes clear boundaries on presidential immunity for every president going forward. Future presidents now know that if they commit crimes outside their constitutional duties, they can be held accountable. If they engage in fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, anything that falls outside the scope of official acts, immunity won't protect them. That's a massive shift in how presidential power works in this country. For decades, there's been this assumption that presidents operate in a special protected category, but the Supreme Court just said no, that protection is limited, and that changes the entire calculus for how presidents behave and how they're held accountable. This precedent will shape executive accountability for generations. Point 4, the political and financial pressure is mounting fast. This isn't just about legal cases. Trump is facing serious financial consequences too. Fraud judgments that have been delayed are now being enforced. Asset freezes are in effect. Properties could be seized. Bank accounts could be frozen. The financial empire he's built is under direct threat. And politically, the ruling gives allies permission to distance themselves. It's one thing to support someone when they claim immunity and the law is unclear. It's another thing to support someone when the Supreme Court has explicitly said their actions are not protected and they're facing criminal charges. We're seeing political support start to erode, allies hedging their bets, fewer people willing to go to bat for Trump when the legal situation looks this dire. And that isolation compounds the problem because it reduces his political power to fight back. So what happens next? Let's think through the likely scenarios. More criminal charges are coming. Prosecutors now have clear legal authority to move forward with cases they've been building. Grand juries will issue indictments. Trials will be scheduled. And without immunity as a defense, Trump's legal team has to actually fight the cases on the merits. They have to challenge the evidence, argue the facts, try to win in court. And given the evidence that's been reported in many of these cases, that's going to be very difficult. We're likely looking at multiple criminal trials over the next year or two. Civil judgments will be enforced aggressively. The fraud penalties, the damages from lawsuits, all of it is going to be pursued now that the immunity claims are gone. That means asset seizures, property liens, financial pressure that could force Trump to liquidate assets or restructure his entire business empire. The financial consequences alone could be devastating. Congressional investigations will intensify. With no immunity defense, Trump will face increasing pressure to testify, to produce documents, to cooperate with investigations. If he refuses, he risks contempt charges. If he complies, he risks providing evidence that could be used against him in criminal cases. It's a no-win situation. Political isolation will continue to grow. As the legal situation deteriorates, more allies will distance themselves. Political support will erode. His ability to influence elections and control the Republican Party will diminish, because ultimately, political power depends on perception, and the perception right now is that Trump is in serious legal trouble with no way out. That's not the image of strength and invincibility that his political brand depends on. The precedent will reshape future presidencies. Future presidents will operate with the knowledge that immunity is limited, that crimes committed in office can lead to prosecution after leaving office, that accountability is real and consequences are possible. That could change behavior. It could make presidents more cautious about pushing legal boundaries. It could strengthen the rule of law by making clear that no one is above it. And look, we need to talk about what this means for democracy and the rule of law, because for years, there's been this question hanging over everything. Can the system actually hold powerful people accountable? Or is the presidency such a powerful office that it puts people beyond the reach of the law? The Supreme Court just answered that question. They said no, the presidency doesn't put you above the law. You can be held accountable for crimes. You can face consequences. The rule of law applies to everyone, including presidents. That's fundamental to how democracy works. If presidents are above the law, if they can commit crimes without consequences, then we don't really have a democracy. We have something else. So this ruling, as much as it's about Trump specifically, is also about the health of our democratic system. It's about whether our institutions can function the way they're supposed to, whether checks and balances are real or just theoretical. Does this mean Trump will definitely be convicted and go to prison? No, he still has the right to defend himself. He can challenge the evidence. He can argue his case in court. Juries will decide his guilt or innocence. But what's changed is that he has to actually face those proceedings. He can't hide behind immunity anymore. He can't claim the law doesn't apply to him. He has to go through the same legal process as anyone else accused of crimes. And that's what accountability looks like. So is this the end for Trump? The collapse of his power and influence? Maybe. We'll see how the legal cases play out. We'll see how the political landscape shifts. But what's clear is that something fundamental has changed. The Supreme Court has removed the shield he's been hiding behind for years. The legal system is moving forward with cases that were stalled. The financial and political pressure is mounting, and there's no escape route that makes it all go away. This is accountability happening in real time. This is the rule of law being applied to someone who thought they were above it. And we're watching history unfold. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. It's just entering its most dramatic phase yet.